The sun hammered down on the Arizona desert like God's own anvil, turning the red dust into waves of shimmering heat that made the horizon dance and blur. James Cordell, known only as the Wolf to every bounty hunter, lawman, an outlaw between Tucson and Santa Fe, owed his gray mare through the wasteland with the same expression he'd worn for the past 15 years. Empty, cold, unreachable. His gray-blue eyes, sharp as broken glass, scanned the terrain with mechanical precision. The cicatrix running down the left side of his face from eye to jaw pulled tight when he squinted against the glare. 3 days of stubble darkened his angular features. Dust coated everything: his dark brown leather duster, his black wide-brimmed hat, the twin Colt .45s that hung heavy on his thighs. He didn't speak to himself, hadn't spoken to anyone in 4 days. Words were currency he rarely spent. The overturned stagecoach appeared like a wound in the landscape's splintered wood. Scattered luggage, bodies sprawled in positions that told stories Jim had read too many times before. Bandits, probably the Reeves gang. They'd been working this stretch of territory for 3 months. The Wolf dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel, spurs making soft metallic whispers. His right hand instinctively hovered near his revolver as he approached, though he already knew there was no threat here. Only ghosts. That's when he heard it. A sound so faint he almost mistook it for the wind catching in the wreckage. A whimper. Human. Small. Jim's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough death, but children always hit different. Always opened a crack in the armor he'd spent years forging. He moved toward the sound, his shadow falling across the overturned coach like a dark promise. Inside, wedged between a trunk and the splintered bench, was a boy. Maybe 8 years old, skin pale as moonlight despite the desert sun, blonde hair matted with dust and dried blood that wasn't his own. Green eyes, impossibly green, like spring grass in a place where nothing green survived, stared up at him with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. "You hurt?" Jim's voice came out rougher than he intended, unused to the shape of questions. The boy shook his head, trembling. His small hands clutched a carved wooden horse, the toy worn smooth from countless hours of handling. Jim noticed the child's knuckles were white from gripping it. "Come on, then." Jim extended a weathered hand, calloused from years of gripping reins and triggers. "Can't stay here." The boy hesitated, eyes darting to the bodies outside, then back to Jim's scarred face. Something in those green eyes shifted, a decision made in the wordless language of survival. He reached up and took Jim's hand. His fingers were small, cold despite the heat, and they trembled like captured birds. Jim pulled him out gently, gentler than he'd touched anything in years. The boy's clothes hung off his thin frame, an oversized beige linen shirt, brown suspenders holding up patched trousers, small leather boots that had seen better days. It looked like every orphan Jim had ever passed without stopping, except this time stopping had chosen him. "Ha, write your name?" Jim asked, surprising himself with the question. Names were connections, connections were liabilities. "Thomas," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible over the desert wind. "Everyone calls me Tommy." "You got people, Tommy? Anyone I should take you to?" Boy's face crumpled, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on his cheeks. He shook his head violently, clutching the wooden horse tighter. "They're all gone. Mom and Papa were in the coach. And my sister, Sarah," the single quotes or double quotes he couldn't finish. Jim felt something twist in his chest, a sensation he'd thought he'd killed years ago. Grief was a weakness in his line of work. But looking at this small boy, alone in the world with nothing but a wooden toy and the clothes on his back, Jim couldn't quite summon the coldness he needed. "All right," he said after a long moment. "We'll figure something out." He lifted Tommy onto his mare with surprising care, then swung up behind him. The boy was rigid at first, but as they rode away from the massacre site, away from the only family he'd ever known, Tommy gradually leaned back against Jim's chest. The gesture was so trusting, so complete in its surrender to whatever protection this scarred stranger could offer, that Jim felt his throat tighten. They rode in silence toward Red Canyon, the nearest town, 3 hours away. The afternoon sun began its slow descent, painting the red rock formations in shades of amber and copper. Jim's mind worked through practical problems: where to leave the boy, who might take him in, how quickly he could return to his solitary existence. But Tommy's small body, warm against his own, kept distracting him from these calculations. Red Canyon emerged from the heat shimmer like a mirage made solid, a single main street of packed red dirt. flanked by weathered wooden buildings, the whole settlement dwarfed by towering sandstone cliffs that glowed crimson in the late afternoon light. The town was exactly what Jim expected, a place where people came to disappear or to survive, nothing more. Piano music drifted from the dusty trail saloon, competing with the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer and the murmur of evening conversations, starting up as the brutal heat began to break. Jim guided his mare toward the boarding house run by Sarah Whitmore, a two-story structure that stood slightly apart from the main street, distinguished by actual curtains in its windows and a well-maintained porch. If anyone in this godforsaken town had the heart and means to take in an orphan, it would be the widow Whitmore. Jim had stayed there twice before. She asked few questions and kept her rooms clean, qualities he appreciated. He dismounted and helped Tommy down, the boy's legs unsteady after hours in the saddle. Jim kept one hand on the child's shoulders, steadying him as they climbed the porch steps. Before he could knock, the door opened. Sarah Whitmore stood framed in the doorway, her dark brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, warm brown eyes taking in the scene with quick intelligence. She wore a simple navy dress with a white apron, and despite the heat, she looked composed, capable. "Mr. Cordell," she said, her voice carrying the musical accent of somewhere back east. Her gaze dropped to Tommy, and her expression immediately softened. "And who's this young man?" "Tommy," Jim said simply. "His family was killed. Stagecoach robbery out past Devil's Bend." Sarah's hand went to her throat, a gesture of genuine sympathy that Jim found almost foreign in its sincerity. "Oh, you poor dear. Come inside, both of you. You must be parched." The interior of the boarding house was a stark contrast to the harsh world outside. Clean wooden floors, whitewashed walls, lace curtains filtering the golden evening light into something almost gentle. Sarah led them to her kitchen, a space that smelled of bread and herbs, and immediately set about preparing water and food. Jim stood awkwardly, his leather duster and gun belt seeming too large, too violent for this domestic space. Tommy sat at the kitchen table, still clutching his wooden horse, eyes following Sarah's movements with the watchfulness of a child who'd learned that safety was temporary. She placed a glass of water and a plate of bread with butter in front of him, then crouched to his eye level. "I'm Mrs. Whitmore," she said gently. "You're safe here, Tommy. I promise." The boy nodded slowly, then began to eat with the careful, measured bites of someone who'd gone hungry before. Jim watched this exchange from the doorway, feeling increasingly out of place. He'd delivered the boy to safety. His obligation was fulfilled. He should leave. "He'll need a place to stay," Jim said, his voice rougher than the situation warranted. "I thought maybe you'd know someone who could take him in. Or maybe the church." "He can stay here," Sarah interrupted, straightening to face Jim directly. Her eyes held something that might have been challenge, or perhaps disappointment. "At least for tonight. We can make proper arrangements in the morning." Jim nodded, feeling both relief and an unexpected reluctance. "I'll be at the saloon if you need anything. I'll pay for his keep through the week. After that, ... he left the sentence unfinished. "After that, we'll see," Sarah said, her tone making it clear she found his eagerness to disentangle himself less than admirable. "Tommy, would you like to see your room?" The boy looked from Sarah to Jim, confusion and something like panic crossing his small face. "Is he leaving?" The question hit Jim like a fist. In Tommy's voice was a world of loss, parents gone, sister gone, and now the stranger who'd pulled him from the wreckage was disappearing too. Jim had no experience with childhood attachment, with the desperate need for continuity that drove children to cling to any anchor in a storm. "Just for tonight," Jim heard himself say, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. "I'll be around." Relief washed over Tommy's features, and he nodded, finally allowing Sarah to lead him away. Jim stood alone in the kitchen, the sound of their footsteps fading up the stairs. He looked at his hands, scarred, weathered, made for violence. Not for this. Never for this. He left the boarding house and walked toward the saloon, spurs clinking with each step, drawing the usual attention his presence always commanded. Men watched him from doorways and windows, conversations dying as he passed. The wolf. The man who'd killed 12 men in Tombstone. The bounty hunter who'd brought in Marcus Cobra, Reeves' brother, dead across a saddle. Reputation was armor, and Jim wore his without conscious thought. The dusty trail was exactly what every frontier saloon was. Dim, smoky, smelling of whiskey and unwashed bodies. A piano player hammered out something that might have been a melody. Card games clustered around tables where money and lies changed hands with equal frequency. Jim took a corner table, his back to the wall, ordered whiskey, and tried to think about his next job, his next move. Anything but the green-eyed boy now sleeping in Sarah Whitmore's boarding house. But Tommy's small hand in his kept returning to his thoughts, persistent as a ghost. The night passed slowly. Jim drank without getting drunk, a skill he'd perfected years ago, and watched the saloon's patrons cycle through their familiar rituals of bravado and desperation. He didn't speak to anyone, and no one approached him. Around midnight, he paid his tab and walked back to the boarding house, letting himself into the small room Sarah had given him before, the one on the ground floor, away from the other guests. Sleep didn't come. Jim lay on the narrow bed, still fully dressed except for his boots, listening to the building settle and creak around him. Somewhere above, Tommy was sleeping or trying to in a strange bed, in a strange town, with his entire world reduced to a wooden horse and memories that would haunt him for years. Jim knew about haunting memories. He'd been collecting them since he was barely older than Tommy. Morning came with the brutal efficiency of desert sunlight. Jim rose, strapped on his gun belt, and descended to the kitchen where Sarah was already preparing breakfast. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, incongruously domestic. "He's still sleeping," Sarah said without preamble. "First real sleep he's had in days, I'd wager." Jim poured himself coffee, black and strong. "That's good. What are your plans, Mr. Cordell?" The question was direct, her brown eyes steady on his face. Jim appreciated her lack of games. "I'm thinking the church might take him. Or maybe there's a family in town who Is that really what you're thinking?" Sarah interrupted, her voice quiet but firm. "Or is that what you're hoping, because it's easier than admitting that boy has already attached himself to you?" Jim's jaw tightened. "I'm not father material, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm a bounty hunter. I live on the trail. I kill people for money. That's no life for a child." "Perhaps not," Sarah agreed, surprising him. "But sometimes life doesn't ask what we think we're suitable for. It asks what we're willing to become." She paused, then added more gently, "He woke up twice last night crying. Called for his mother, his sister, and then, Mr. Cordell, he called for you." The words landed like bullets. Jim set down his coffee cup carefully, trying to ignore the tightness in his chest. "He doesn't even know me. Children don't need to know you. They need to feel safe with you. And for whatever reason, Tommy feels safe with you." Before Jim could formulate a response that would explain why this was impossible, why he was the worst choice in the world for a guardian, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Tommy appeared in the doorway, his blonde hair sticking up at odd angles, his green eyes still heavy with sleep. He wore an overlarge nightshirt Sarah must have found for him. His gaze went immediately to Jim, and his entire small body relaxed when he confirmed the gunslinger was still there. "Morning," Tommy said quietly, clutching his wooden horse. "Morning," Jim replied, the word catching slightly in his throat. Tommy climbed into a chair at the table, and Sarah placed a plate of eggs and bacon in front of him. For a few moments they ate in silence, an oddly peaceful domestic scene that felt completely wrong with Jim's gun belt and scarred face at the table. "Are you really a bounty hunter?" Tommy asked suddenly, looking up at Jim with those unsettling green eyes. "I am. You catch bad people?" "Something like that." Tommy considered this, chewing thoughtfully. "That's good. Bad people should be caught." Jim didn't know how to explain the moral ambiguity of his work to an 8-year-old, so he said nothing. Sarah watched this exchange with an expression that might have been approval or might have been calculation. Jim couldn't quite read her. "Tommy," Sarah said gently, "Mr. Cordell and I were discussing where you might stay. There's a nice family in town, the Richardsons, who might know." Tommy's voice was small but absolute. His knuckles went white around his fork. "I want to stay with him." He pointed at Jim without looking up from his plate. "Tommy, I'm not ... double quotes," Jim started, then stopped. "How did you explain to a traumatized child that you were broken? That you'd been moving through the world like a ghost for 15 years? That you didn't know how to care for anything except your horse and your guns?" "Please," Tommy whispered. And now he did look up, those green eyes swimming with tears he was trying desperately to hold back. "Please, Papa." The word detonated in the quiet kitchen like a dynamite charge. Papa. Spoken with such desperate hope, such complete need, that it bypassed every defense Jim had spent years constructing. He opened his mouth to correct the boy, to establish the necessary distance, but nothing came out. He looked at Sarah, who was watching him with an expression that clearly said the choice was his, and his alone. "I traveled," Jim finally managed. "I can't. I'm not set up for a child." "Then get set up," Sarah said quietly. "Or leave him here and I'll find him a family. But be honest with yourself about what you're choosing, Mr. Cordell." Jim looked at Tommy, really looked at him. Saw not just an inconvenient complication to his solitary life, but a small human being who'd lost everything and was reaching out for the one solid thing he could find in a world that had just proven itself catastrophically unsafe. And Jim realized with a sinking sensation that he'd already made his choice the moment he'd pulled Tommy from that overturned coach. "All right," he said, the words tasting foreign in his mouth. "We'll figure something out." Tommy's face transformed, tears spilling over, but accompanied now by a smile so bright it seemed to light the dim kitchen. He pushed back from the table and ran to Jim, throwing his small arms around the gunslinger's waist and holding on with fierce intensity. Jim's hands hovered uncertainly before awkwardly patting the boy's back. Over Tommy's head, Sarah smiled at him with something that looked like respect. "You're doing the right thing," she said. Jim wasn't sure about that at all. But as Tommy clung to him, this small piece of humanity that had somehow decided Jim Cordell was worth trusting, the bounty hunter felt something shift inside himself. Not healing. Nothing so simple. But maybe the first recognition that healing was possible. The next 3 days passed in a strange blur of domesticity that Jim navigated like foreign terrain. Sarah helped him purchase clothes for Tommy that actually fit: proper shirts, pants, a small leather jacket, boots that didn't pinch. Jim paid without comment, watching his carefully saved money disappear into the care and feeding of another human being. Tommy stayed close to him, shadow-like, clearly terrified that if he let Jim out of his sight, the gunslinger would vanish like everyone else. They ate meals together at the boarding house. Jim taught Tommy how to care for horses, how to check a saddle for wear, basic knots. Nothing dangerous, Jim was careful about that. The boy absorbed everything with intense focus, as if proving his usefulness might convince Jim to keep him around. It broke something in Jim that he didn't know could still break. On the 4th morning, Jim was in the stable behind the boarding house, checking his mare's hooves, Tommy sitting on a hay bale nearby, whittling at a piece of wood with a small knife Jim had given him, carefully supervised. The peace of the moment was shattered by the sound of multiple horses entering town at speed. Jim's hand went instinctively to his revolver as he moved to the stable door, positioning himself between Tommy and whatever was coming. 6 riders pulled up on Main Street, their horses lathered and breathing hard. Jim recognized the lead rider immediately, and his blood went cold. Marcus "Cobra" Reeves, 42 years old, built like a bull, with a square face dominated by a thick black and gray beard and eyes as dead as stones. He wore a black hat with a snakeskin band, a long black coat despite the heat, and his signature revolver with an ivory grip hung at his hip. The 5 men with him were his crew, each one wanted for murder, robbery, or worse. Jim had killed Cobra's younger brother 2 years ago, collected the bounty, and never looked back. He'd known eventually there would be a reckoning. He just hadn't expected it to come now when he had something to lose. "Stay here," Jim said quietly to Tommy, not taking his eyes off the street. "Don't come out no matter what you hear." "But Tommy..." Jim looked at the boy, his scarred face harder than Tommy had ever seen it. "Stay here." The boy nodded, fear widening his green eyes, and Jim felt a pang of guilt for putting that fear there. But better fear than death. Jim checked his revolvers, both loaded, both ready, and stepped out into the morning sun. The street had already cleared, townspeople vanishing into buildings with the practiced efficiency of those who knew when violence was about to erupt. Only Cobra and his men remained, spread across the width of the street, blocking any escape route. Jim walked forward slowly, his duster catching the slight breeze, spurs clinking with each step. He stopped 30 feet from Cobra, the classic dueling distance. "Reeves," Jim said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Long time. Not long enough, Wolf." Cobra's voice was gravel and whiskey, his accent bearing traces of Missouri. "You killed my brother. Left him dead in the street like a dog. He drew first, made his choice, and now you're going to make yours." Cobra's hand hovered over his ivory-gripped revolver. His men tensed, ready. Jim calculated odds, 6 against 1. Not impossible, but not good. He'd need to take Cobra first, then the man to his right who looked fastest. After that, it would be chaos and luck. "Papa." The word cut through the tension like a church bell. Jim's heart stopped. No. Not now. Not this. Tommy had disobeyed, had come out of the stable, and now stood on the porch of the boarding house, his small figure dwarfed by the adult world of violence he'd wandered into. His green eyes were locked on Jim, that wooden horse clutched in one hand. "Papa, please don't fight," Tommy said, his voice small but clear in the silence. "Please." The effect on Cobra and his men was immediate and visible. Their gun hands relaxed slightly. Confusion replaced some of the killing intent in their faces. Cobra stared at Tommy, then at Jim, then back at Tommy. "Papa?" Cobra repeated, the word sounding strange in his rough voice. "The Wolf's got a son?" Jim said nothing. His mind raced through scenarios, all of them ending in Tommy witnessing violence no child should see. Or worse, Tommy becoming collateral damage. Every instinct screamed at him to draw, to end this before Cobra thought too much about the tactical advantage a hostage would provide. But Tommy was looking at him with such trust, such certainty that Jim would make this right, that he hesitated. "I didn't know," Cobra said slowly. One of his men shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Didn't know you had a boy." Found him 4 days ago, Jim said, keeping his voice steady. Orphaned in a stage robbery. Not mine by blood, but mine to protect. Something flickered in Cobra's dead eyes, not quite humanity, but maybe memory of humanity. He looked at his men, saw their discomfort. Killing a man was business. Killing a man in front of his child was something else. Western outlaws had their own strange code, and that code had limits. "Tommy," Jim called without turning, his eyes never leaving Cobra. "Go back inside, but Papa now." "Son." The word son came out naturally, unconsciously, and Jim felt the truth of it settle into his chest. Not by blood, maybe never by law, but in every way that mattered, this boy was his. To protect, to raise, to fail or succeed with. The enormity of it should have terrified him. Instead, it focused him with laser clarity. Tommy disappeared back into the boarding house, and Jim saw Sarah appear in the doorway, pulling the boy inside and closing the door. Good. Now it was just men and guns and choices. "Your quarrels with me, Reeves," Jim said. "Nobody else needs to die here." Cobra sat his horse in silence, his men waiting for his signal. The moment stretched taut as piano wire. Then, impossibly, Cobra's gun hand moved away from his revolver. He straightened in his saddle, his face settling into something that might have been respect or might have been disgust. Jim couldn't tell which. "My brother was a fool who drew on a faster man," Cobra said finally. "That's on him. But I'm not about to kill a man in front of his boy. That's not how I work." He wheeled his horse around, and his men followed suit, the tension bleeding from the scene like water from cracked leather. But before riding off, Cobra looked back over his shoulder. "We're square on the brother, Wolf. But don't mistake this for friendship. Cross me again and I'll kill you. Just not today. Not in front of the boy." They rode out of Red Canyon in a cloud of red dust, leaving Jim standing alone in the middle of the street, his hands shaking slightly with adrenaline that had nowhere to go. Townspeople began emerging from buildings, murmuring to each other in amazement. Jim ignored them, turning to walk back to the boarding house. Sarah opened the door before he reached it, Tommy already pushing past her to run to Jim. The boy collided with the gunslinger's legs, wrapping his arms around him and holding on tight. "I thought he was going to hurt you," Tommy said into Jim's coat. "I know," Jim said quietly, crouching down to the boy's level. His scarred face softened in a way few had ever seen. "But you can't come out like that again, Tommy. When I tell you to stay, you stay. Understand?" Tommy nodded, tears tracking down his dusty face. "I was scared." "Me too," Jim admitted, the confession surprising him. He pulled Tommy into an awkward hug, his gun belt pressing uncomfortably between them, but neither caring. Over the boy's shoulder, Jim met Sarah's eyes. She smiled at him, warm and approving. That evening, Jim sat on the porch of the boarding house as the sun set behind the red cliffs, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. Tommy sat beside him, swinging his legs from the edge of the porch, working on his wood carving. The town settled into its evening rhythms, piano music from the saloon, smell of cooking fires, the low murmur of conversation. "Papa?" Tommy said quietly. Jim still wasn't used to the word, but he was learning to answer to it. "Yeah? Are we going to stay here?" Jim considered the question. He'd been thinking about it all afternoon, turning it over in his mind like a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. His old life, the trail, the hunts, the solitude, felt increasingly impossible with Tommy beside him. But staying in one place, building something stable, something normal, that terrified him more than any gunfight. "I don't know, son," Jim admitted. "I'm not good at staying put." "Could you learn?" Tommy looked up at him with those impossibly green eyes. "Mrs. Whitmore says people can learn anything if they want to enough." Jim thought about Sarah's words from that first morning. Sometimes life doesn't ask what we think we're suitable for. It asks what we're willing to become. "Maybe," he said finally. "We'll see." Tommy seemed satisfied with this answer and returned to his carving. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began emerging in the darkening sky, small points of light in the vast western darkness. Jim felt the weight of his revolvers at his hips, the familiar tools of a trade he'd practiced for half his life. But he also felt the warmth of Tommy's small body beside him, the unexpected trust of a child who decided Jim Cordell was worth calling father. The next morning brought a visitor. Jim was in the stable teaching Tommy how to brush down a horse properly when Sarah appeared in the doorway with Sheriff Bill Hackett, a weathered man in his 50s with gray in his mustache and keen eyes that had seen more than they'd ever tell. "Mr. Cordell," the sheriff said, nodding respectfully. "Word is you had some trouble yesterday with Cobra Reeves." "We came to an understanding," Jim said carefully, his hand instinctively checking that Tommy was behind him. "So I heard." The whole town heard. Hackett's eyes moved to Tommy, softened slightly. "Also heard about your boy." Mrs. Whitmore tells me you pulled him from that stage robbery out past Devil's Bend, that's right. The boy's got no other family? None that we know of, Sarah interjected, her voice carefully neutral. Mr. Cordell has taken responsibility for him, Hackett studied. Jim, with the assessing gaze of a man who'd spent years judging character under pressure. You planning to stay in Red Canyon, Cordell? Or are you going to drag that boy back out onto the trail with you? It was the question Jim had been avoiding. The one that forced him to actually make a decision rather than drifting along in this strange new reality. He looked at Tommy, who was watching him with barely concealed anxiety, his wooden horse gripped tight in one small hand. I'm considering my options, Jim said finally. Well, consider this, Hackett said, his tone firm but not unkind. We could use a deputy here in Red Canyon. Man with your skills, your reputation, pays not great $70 a month, but it comes with a small house on the edge of town. 2 bedrooms, nothing fancy, but it's solid. Jim stared at the sheriff, certain he'd misheard. You want to give me a badge? I want to give you a reason to stay put, Hackett corrected. That boy needs stability. A home, school, eventually. Friends his own age. You can give him that here if you're willing to try something different than running bounties. I've killed people, Sheriff. A lot of people, and most of them needed killing from what I understand. Hackett shrugged. The question isn't who you were, Cordell, it's who you're going to be. For him. He nodded at Tommy. Jim felt the walls of his carefully constructed solitary life crumbling, brick by brick. A badge, a house, a settled life. Everything he'd spent 15 years running from. And yet, looking at Tommy's hopeful face, feeling the boy's absolute trust in him, Jim found he couldn't summon the automatic refusal he would have given a week ago. I'll need to think on it, Jim said. You do that, but don't think too long. That boy deserves an answer. Hackett tipped his hat to Sarah, nodded at Tommy. Ma'am, son. He left the stable, his footsteps fading across the yard. Sarah moved closer to Jim, her brown eyes searching his face. It's a good offer, James. Jim noticed she'd used his first name, not Mr. Cordell, not the wolf, but James. As if she could see past all his defenses to whoever he'd been before. Violence and solitude had carved him into something harder. I don't know how to be what he needs, Jim admitted quietly, the confession costing him something. None of us do at first, Sarah said gently. Being a parent isn't about knowing how. It's about being willing to learn. And you've already started learning, whether you realize it or not. That afternoon, Jim walked to the edge of town, to the small house Sheriff Hackett had mentioned. It was adobe and wood, humble but well-maintained, with a small porch and a view of the Red Cliffs. 2 bedrooms, the sheriff had said. One for him, one for Tommy. A real home. Jim tried to imagine it, waking up in the same place every day, eating regular meals, Tommy going to school while Jim ... What, wore a badge? Kept the peace? Became a member of a community? It felt impossible. It felt terrifying. It felt like exactly what he needed, though he'd never admit it out loud. Tommy found him there an hour later, the boy having tracked him with impressive skill. Jim didn't have the heart to scold him for wandering off from the boarding house. Instead, he picked Tommy up and set him on the porch railing, an action that was becoming more natural each time he did it. This could be ours, Jim said, gesturing at the house. If we stay? Tommy's eyes went wide, darting from the house to Jim and back again. Really? We'd live here, together? If I take the sheriff's offer, become a deputy, would you still be a good guy catching bad people? Yeah, Jim said, the answer coming easier than he expected. Still catching bad people, just ... different. Legal-like. Tommy was quiet for a moment, his expression serious beyond his years. Mama used to say home isn't a place, it's people. People who love you. The words hit Jim like a physical blow. Love. The word had been absent from his vocabulary for so long he'd almost forgotten it existed. But looking at this small boy who'd lost everything and somehow still had hope, still had trust to give, Jim felt something shift in his chest. Not love, not yet maybe, but the possibility of it, the space where it could grow. Your mama was a smart woman, Jim said quietly. Will you be my people, Papa? Tommy asked, the question simple and devastating in its directness. Even if we don't have the same blood? Jim looked at his hands, scarred, weathered, made for violence. Then he looked at Tommy's small face, those green eyes full of hope and fear in equal measure. And James Cordell, the man called the Wolf, the bounty hunter who'd killed 12 men in Tombstone and lived alone for 15 years. Made a decision that terrified him more than any gunfight ever had. Yeah, Tommy, he said, his voice rough with emotion he didn't know how to process. I'll be your people. We'll be each other's people. Tommy launched himself at Jim, small arms wrapping around the gunslinger's neck, holding on like he'd never let go. Jim held him back, awkward but genuine, and felt the last of his armor crack and fall away. He'd spent 15 years convincing himself he didn't need anyone, that connection was weakness. But this boy had proven him wrong in less than a week. Connection wasn't weakness. It was the only thing that made any of this, the violence, the struggle, the endless hard days, worthwhile. That evening, Jim accepted Sheriff Hackett's offer. He'd wear a badge, keep the peace, build something resembling a normal life, for Tommy, and maybe, just maybe, for himself too. Sarah Whitmore's eyes sparkled with approval when he told her, and she impulsively hugged him, a gesture that left Jim standing rigid and uncertain until she pulled back with a laugh. "You're going to be fine, James," she said. Both of you, the next weeks blurred together in a montage of change. Jim moved into the small house with Tommy, the boy claiming his own bedroom with reverent joy. Sarah helped them acquire furniture, basic supplies, all the domestic items Jim had never needed as a solitary drifter. Jim learned to cook simple meals badly at first, but improving. Tommy started attending the small schoolhouse, where he proved bright and eager to learn despite the trauma still shadowing his green eyes. Jim wore the deputy's badge awkwardly, but Sheriff Hackett proved patient, teaching him the difference between bringing in a bounty dead or alive and actually protecting a community. The skills translated better than Jim expected. His reputation helped criminals thought twice before causing trouble in Red Canyon when they knew the wolf was wearing a badge there now. Tommy thrived in ways that broke and healed Jim simultaneously. The boy's nightmares came less frequently. His smile appeared more often. He made friends at school tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Jim attended a school recitation where Tommy spoke 3 lines from a poem and felt a fierce pride he didn't know he was capable of feeling. Sarah became a constant presence in their lives, teaching Jim the 1,000 small things he'd never learned about raising a child, her patience seemingly endless. 3 months passed in this new life, and Jim found himself settling into routines he'd once have called impossible. Morning coffee on the porch while Tommy got ready for school, rounds through town, checking on businesses, resolving disputes, dinners that he cooked himself, still simple but edible, reading to Tommy at bedtime from books Sarah loaned them. Small rituals that built, day by day, into something that felt dangerously close to happiness. It was on a cold November morning, frost touching the red dust for the first time that season, when Jim's past came back in full force. He was in the sheriff's office, reviewing wanted posters with Hackett, when the door burst open. A young rancher named Pete Miller stood there, breathing hard, face pale with fear. "Deputy Cordell, you gotta come quick. There's riders coming, at least a dozen. They're heavily armed and heading straight for town." Jim's blood went cold. His hand instinctively checked his revolvers, both present, both loaded. "You recognize any of them?" "The lead rider's got a black hat with a snakeskin band," Pete said, and Jim's worst fear was confirmed. "Cobra Reeves," Sheriff Hackett said grimly, already reaching for his shotgun. "Thought you two had an understanding?" "We did," Jim said, his mind racing. "But understanding's got limits. He's here for me. Then we'll face him together. I'll get the men." "No." Jim's voice was firm. "This is between me and him. Keep the townspeople inside. Keep them safe." And Sheriff ... double quotes, he paused, the next words harder than any he'd spoken. "If this goes bad, Tommy, I'll see he's cared for," Hackett said quietly. "You have my word." Jim nodded, grateful he didn't have to say more. He checked his guns one final time, then stepped out into the cold morning air. The main street was already clearing, word having spread with the speed that only true danger could generate. Jim walked to the center of the street, his breath misting in the cold air, his long leather duster settling around him like the old days. But he wasn't the same man he'd been in the old days. He had something to live for now, something to lose. The riders appeared at the far end of town, silhouettes against the rising sun. 12 of them, just as Pete had said. Cobra Reeves led them, his black coat and signature hat unmistakable. They rode slowly, deliberately, giving the confrontation the weight of ritual. Jim counted odds 12-1. Even for him, that was suicide, but he'd face it anyway. He'd always known his violent past would demand payment eventually. Cobra and his men stopped 50 feet away. The outlaw dismounted slowly, his dead eyes fixed on Jim. His men stayed mounted, forming a semicircle that blocked any escape. "Wolf," Cobra said, his gravel voice carrying in the cold air. "Been 3 months. Figured that was long enough to let things cool down. We had an understanding," Jim said carefully. "You rode away." "That I did, because of the boy." Cobra took 3 steps forward, close enough now that Jim could see the cruelty carved into every line of his face. "But then I got to thinking, got to hearing stories. The wolf's gone soft, wearing a badge, playing house, raising that orphan like he's suddenly some kind of saint. What I do is my business, it is. Right up until it affects mine. Cobra's hand hovered over his ivory-gripped revolver. See, your reputation kept people afraid. That fear kept them in line. But now they're saying the wolf's lost his teeth. That's bad for business, Wolf. Bad for everyone who trades on fear and respect. Jim understood then. This wasn't about revenge for Cobra's brother. This was about reputation, the only currency that mattered in their world. Cobra couldn't afford to let Jim's transformation go unchallenged. It made both of them look weak. So what are you proposing? Jim asked, though he already knew the answer. You and me. Right here. Like the old days. Winner walks away. Loser ... double. Cobra smiled without warmth. Well, the loser don't walk anywhere. Behind Cobra, his men shifted in their saddles. Jim saw them clearly, now 12 armed outlaws, all loyal to Cobra, all willing to kill. Even if Jim won the duel, they'd gun him down after. This was an execution dressed up as honor, and if I refuse, then we burn this town to the ground. Starting with that little house on the edge where you live. The one with the boy inside. Fear turned to ice in Jim's veins. Tommy. He'd known this was about him, but hearing the threat spoken aloud made it real. Cobra had found the perfect leverage, not Jim's life, but Tommy's safety. Tommy's at school, Jim said, the lie coming smoothly. Is he? Cobra's smile widened. My men checked. School's closed today, some kind of holiday, which means that boy's probably in your house right now, playing with his toys, not knowing his papa's about to die. Jim's mind raced. Tommy was home. Sarah was supposed to be watching him, but if she'd gone to the market, if Tommy was alone, ... he couldn't risk it. Couldn't risk Cobra making good on his threat just to prove a point. But how could he outdraw Cobra and survive his 11 men? The answer was simple. He couldn't. Papa. No. Not again. Not this. Tommy stood on the porch of the sheriff's office, flanked by Sheriff Hackett and Sarah, both of whom had clearly tried and failed to keep the boy inside. Tommy's green eyes were wide with fear, his wooden horse clutched in both hands. But his face held something else too, to determination. Trust. The absolute certainty that his papa would make this right. Cobra turned to look at the boy, and something flickered across his hard face. The same thing that had made him lower his guns 3 months ago. The presence of a child changed the mathematics of violence in ways that even the hardest men couldn't ignore. There's your boy, Cobra said quietly, turning back to Jim. Loyal little thing, ain't he? Watching his papa face down death. Let me take him inside, Sarah called out, her voice shaking slightly. He doesn't need to see this. No, Cobra said, not taking his eyes off Jim. Let him watch. Let him see what kind of man his papa really is. A killer, same as me. I'm not the same as you, Jim said. The words coming from somewhere deep inside him, somewhere he'd thought was dead. I was, but I'm not anymore. Because of the boy? Cobra's laugh was bitter. One kid don't change what you are, Wolf. Don't change the blood on your hands. Maybe not, Jim admitted. But he changed what I'm gonna be. He saw it then, the flicker in Cobra's eyes. Not softness exactly, but something. Memory, perhaps, of a time before he'd become what he was now. Everyone had been someone else once. Everyone had made choices that led them to this moment. Cobra, Jim said quietly, a new strategy forming in his mind. You remember Jake Morrison? Cobra's face hardened. Don't speak his name. Your brother told me about him before ... before it ended. Told me Morrison was your friend. Your partner. Said you two were gonna start a ranch down in Texas. Get out of the life. That was a long time ago, Cobra said, but his gun hand had moved away from his revolver. Morrison had a kid, didn't he? Little girl, you were gonna be her uncle. Help raise her, right? She died, Cobra said, his voice flat and cold. Fever took her when she was 7. Morrison went crazy with grief. Got himself killed robbing a bank 6 months later. That's when I learned the truth. You don't build nothing in this world. You just take what you can before it's taken from you. Or, Jim said carefully, you learned the wrong lesson. Maybe Morrison died because he lost his reason for living. Maybe if that girl had survived, he'd have found the strength to actually become something different. Cobra stared at him, those dead eyes betraying nothing. The moment stretched out, cold wind whistling through the silent street. Jim could feel Tommy's gaze on him, Sarah's fear, the entire town holding its breath. You think that boy makes you different? Cobra asked finally. I know he does, Jim said, because 3 months ago I'd have drawn on you already. Would have tried to take you and as many of your men as I could before they gunned me down. Would have died rather than show weakness. He paused, then continued with complete honesty. But now I'm standing here talking instead of shooting. Because if I die, Tommy loses another father, and I won't do that to him. Not if there's any other way. Cobra's jaw worked, muscles twitching. His men watched him, waiting for the signal. One word and they'd turn Red Canyon into a bloodbath. Jim had seen it happen before, had been part of it happening. But he stood still, his hands away from his guns, making himself vulnerable in a way he never had before. "You're a fool, Wolf," Cobra said finally. "Probably," Jim agreed. "But I'm a fool with something to live for. What do you have?" The question landed like a bullet. Cobra's face twisted with something that might have been rage or might have been pain. The two were often indistinguishable in men who'd spent too long in violence. "I have respect," Cobra said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You have fear," Jim corrected gently. "That's not the same thing. And fear don't keep you warm at night. Don't give your life meaning. It's just ... empty." For a long moment nothing happened. Then Cobra looked past Jim to where Tommy stood on the porch, small and frightened but refusing to run. The outlaw's face did something complicated, memories warring with the man he'd become. "That boy called you Papa," Cobra said. "Not once, but twice. You do right by him, you hear me? Don't let him become what we became." Jim's throat tightened. "I won't." Cobra nodded slowly, then turned to his men. "We're leaving." "Boss?" one of them said, confusion clear in his voice. "But you said—" "I said we're leaving." Cobra's voice carried the authority of a man who'd killed enough people that his word was law. He swung back onto his horse, then looked down at Jim one last time. "We're square now, Wolf. All debts paid. But next time I see you, if you've let that boy down, if you've gone back to the old ways, I'll kill you myself. Understand?" "I understand," Jim said. Cobra wheeled his horse and rode out, his men following in confusion and relief. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the cold morning, leaving Red Canyon in stunned silence. Jim stood in the street, shaking slightly with adrenaline that had nowhere to go, hardly believing he was still alive. Then Tommy was running to him, having broken free from Sarah and the sheriff, his small legs carrying him as fast as they could. Jim dropped to one knee and caught the boy, holding him tight as Tommy cried into his shoulder. "I thought he was going to hurt you," Tommy sobbed. "I thought you were going to die." "I know," Jim said, his voice rough. "But I didn't. Because of you? Because of me? Because you gave me something worth staying alive for." Jim pulled back to look at Tommy's tear-streaked face. "Before you, I didn't care much whether I lived or died. Made me dangerous, but it also made me ... empty. But now I got a reason to be careful, to choose words over bullets. Because I got a son who needs me. Do you really think of me as your son?" Tommy asked, the question small and vulnerable. Jim realized he'd said it without thinking, without the careful distance he used to maintain, but it was the truth. Blood didn't make family. Choice did. Love did. "Yeah, Tommy," Jim said, pulling the boy close again. "You're my son. If you'll have me as your pa." "I will," Tommy said fiercely. "Forever and ever." Sarah reached them then, tears streaming down her face, and pulled them both into an embrace that somehow felt right. Sheriff Hackett stood nearby, gruff but clearly moved. The town began emerging from buildings. People talking excitedly about what they'd witnessed. The wolf facing down 12 men with words instead of guns, and winning. That evening, after Tommy had finally been coaxed into bed. Exhausted from the day's emotions, Jim sat on his small porch and stared at the stars. Sarah joined him, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. She passed him one and sat in the chair beside him. "You did something remarkable today," she said quietly. "I got lucky," Jim replied. "Cobra could have just as easily killed us all, but he didn't, because you reached past his armor the way Tommy reached past yours." Sarah sipped her coffee, then added, "You're becoming the man that boy believes you are." "I'm trying," Jim admitted. "Some days I don't know what I'm doing. Don't know if I'm enough. None of us are enough," Sarah said gently. "That's why we need each other. You and Tommy, you saved each other. But you don't have to do this alone, James." He looked at her then, really looked. Saw the warmth in her brown eyes, the gentle strength that had been supporting him through this whole impossible transformation. Sarah had been there from the beginning, helping him become a father when he had no idea how, never asking for anything in return. "Sarah," he said carefully, I'm not good at this, at letting people in, at building something with another person." "I know," she said, smiling slightly. "But you weren't good at being a father either. And look at you now. Maybe you just need practice." Jim felt something shift in his chest, the possibility of something beyond survival, beyond just getting through each day. The possibility of building a real life with real connections with people who cared about him and whom he cared about in return. "Maybe," he said, allowing himself a small smile. "I reckon I could use the practice." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, the desert night settling around them with its particular peace. Inside the house, Tommy slept safely, his wooden horse on the nightstand beside him. In the morning, Jim would put on his deputy's badge and make his rounds. Tommy would go to school and learn his letters. Sarah would teach Jim how to make proper biscuits, probably laughing at his first dozen failed attempts. It was such a small, ordinary life compared to what Jim had lived before. No grand adventures, no legendary gunfights, no infamy whispered in saloons across the territory. Just a man raising a boy, learning to be part of a community, building something that might last beyond violence and reputation. But as Jim sat there with Sarah beside him and Tommy sleeping peacefully inside, he realized that this small, ordinary life was worth more than all his years as the wolf, because this life had love in it, had purpose, had a future that stretched beyond the next bounty, the next fight, the next lonely night on the trail. 6 months later, Red Canyon's small church hosted a wedding. Jim stood at the altar in his best clothes, still uncomfortable in anything but his working gear, and watched Sarah walk down the aisle. Tommy served as ring-bearer, beaming with pride and joy, his wooden horse safely tucked in his jacket pocket. Sheriff Hackett stood as Jim's best man, having become something like the father Jim had never had. They were married by Reverend Mitchell in a simple ceremony that nonetheless felt monumental. Sarah became not just Tommy's guardian, but his mother in truth, bringing a gentleness and wisdom to their household that balanced Jim's rough edges. Tommy flourished with 2 parents, his nightmares becoming rare, his smile constant. Jim never stopped being careful. His past wasn't fully buried. Men like him always had ghosts that could resurface, but he'd learned to live with vigilance without letting it consume him. He taught Tommy to shoot, but emphasized when not to as much as how to. He wore his badge with growing confidence, earning respect not through fear, but through fairness. He became Deputy Cordell, husband and father, a man defined by what he built rather than what he destroyed. On Tommy's 9th birthday, Jim gave him a new wooden horse, this one carved by Jim's own hands during long evenings on the porch. It wasn't as fine as the original, but Tommy treasured it even more because of where it came from. The old horse went in a box under Tommy's bed, a reminder of loss and survival and the day everything changed. "Papa," Tommy said that night after his birthday celebration as Jim tucked him into bed. "Do you ever miss it?" "The old life?" Jim considered the question honestly. Sometimes he admitted the freedom, maybe, the simplicity. "But then I look at you, at Sarah, at the life we've built, and I realize I was never free before. I was just running. Now I'm free because I chose to stay." "I'm glad you stayed," Tommy said sleepily. "Me too, son. Me too." Years would pass. Tommy would grow tall and strong, would eventually leave Red Canyon to attend university back east, would make Jim and Sarah proud beyond measure. Jim's hair would gray, his face would line further, but the hardness that had once defined him would soften into something warmer. Sarah would be his anchor, his home, the evidence that even broken men could heal. And sometimes on quiet evenings when he sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the red cliffs in gold and crimson, Jim would remember that morning when he pulled a small orphan from a wrecked stagecoach, would remember green eyes full of desperate hope, a wooden horse clutched in small hands, the word Papa spoken with such trust that it had cracked open a heart Jim thought was dead. He'd been called the Wolf. He'd killed men, lived hard, walked alone through violent years that should have ended with a bullet bearing his name, but that little boy had seen something in him worth saving, had called him father before Jim even understood what that meant. And in choosing to answer that call, in choosing to become the man Tommy believed he could be, James Cordell had finally found the thing he'd been running from his entire life: redemption. Not earned through violence, but given freely by a child who needed a father and a man who needed to be needed. The sun set behind the red cliffs, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. Inside the house, Sarah hummed while preparing dinner. In town, people went about their evening routines, secure in the knowledge that Deputy Cordell kept watch. And on the porch, Jim sat with his coffee, his badge catching the last rays of light, his gun still present but no longer defining him. He was the wolf no longer. He was just Jim, father, husband, deputy, human. And that, he'd learned, was more than enough.